May 1945. The air of Europe is still thick with the smell of gunpowder and death, but it is already intoxicating with the aroma of long-awaited victory. A red flag flutters over the ruins of the Reichstag in Berlin. Cost of unimaginable sacrifices. 27 million lives has crushed Nazi Germany and stands before the world in the halo of invincible military might. Tank armadas that crossed half a continent, millions of soldiers under arms, and advanced engineering that created the world's best weaponry. It seemed there was no task this victorious state could not handle, this titan that had endured the most terrible war in human history. But behind the grand facade of military glory hid a quiet, grueling catastrophe, invisible in the parades. It was unfolding not on the battlefields, but in the silent depths of the sea and on deserted piers. The great land power, the victor, on the continent, found itself almost defenseless and helpless before the ocean. Its fleet military, merchant, and, most critically, fishing was mortally wounded. A country stretching across 11 time zones and washed by 13 seas, stood on the brink of a new battle, a battle against hunger and devastation which could not be won without a fleet. And it was this quiet, non-obvious catastrophe that forced the proud government of victors to make a paradoxical, ideologically difficult, but absolutely inevitable decision to turn to enemies and allies, to capitalists and socialists, with a request to build a fleet for the Soviet Union. This is the story of how a country building a bright future, with its own hands, was forced to buy workhorses of the seas from abroad, creating a unique fleet under a foreign flag. Before understanding the scale of the post-war need, one must appreciate the scale of the losses. For the USSR, the war at sea was unlike the grand battleship clashes in the Pacific or the Battle of the Atlantic. It was a grueling, brutal struggle along coastal communication lines, in minefields, and under air attack. And the price of this struggle was enormous. At the beginning of the war, the Soviet Navy was a formidable force, with about 1,000 warships of various classes. It included 3 battleships, 8 cruisers, 54 flotilla leaders and destroyers, 12 submarines, and hundreds of smaller vessels. During the war, the Navy's irreversible losses amounted to 1,014 ships and vessels. Among them were 2 cruisers, Chervona Ukraina, Comintern, 4 flotilla leaders, 30 destroyers, and 102 submarines. The losses in the first 2 years of the war were particularly heavy, with the fleet losing 3 times more ships than the enemy. The fleet's personnel suffered irreparable losses. 154,071 people, including 10,729 officers, were killed in action. But an even more crushing blow was dealt to the civilian fleet, the very foundation that binds the country together and feeds it. The Soviet merchant marine lost almost half of its pre-war tonnage during the war, while in September 1939 the merchant fleet had 344 vessels. By 1945, a significant number of them lay at the bottom of the Baltic, Black, and Barents Seas. The losses of the fishing fleet, though less documented in public sources, were no less catastrophic. Fishing signers and trawlers were mobilized for military needs, becoming patrol boats, minesweepers, and supply vessels, and perished alongside warships. Hundreds of civilian vessels were sunk by mines, torpedoes, and aerial bombs. As a result, by 1945, the fishing industry, especially in the European part of the country, was practically paralyzed. There was no one and nothing to go to sea on. Some compensation came from vessels received through Lend-Lease, from the Allies primarily the famous Liberty and Victoria type transports and captured ships from Germany and its satellites. But this was a drop in the ocean. Captured vessels were usually outdated and required major repairs, and Lend-Lease supplies ceased immediately after the war ended. The Soviet Union was left alone with its destroyed maritime infrastructure and colossal needs. Ships can be built, but this requires shipyards. And Soviet shipyards, especially in the western part of the country, lay in ruins. They were a priority target for German troops and aviation. Mykolaiv, the heart of Black Sea shipbuilding. Here, at the Andrei Marty and 61 Communard shipyards, cruisers, flotilla leaders, destroyers, and the world's largest submarines were built before the war. In the autumn of 1941, the city was captured. Before retreating, some equipment was evacuated, but the shipyards themselves were blown up. What the Soviet troops did not have time to destroy, the Germans destroyed during their retreat in 1944. The slipways, assembly shops, and docks were all turned into piles of twisted metal. Reconstruction was slow, carried out mainly by women and teenagers, and there could be no question of laying down new large vessels in the coming years. Leningrad, the main base of the Baltic Fleet and a center of advanced shipbuilding. The Admiralty shipyards, the Baltic shipyard, and the Sudomec plant were effectively on the front line for the 900 days of the siege. Despite hunger, cold, and constant shelling, they continued to work. During the war, Leningrad shipbuilders delivered 7 submarines and 20 armored boats to the fleet and repaired about 300 ships and vessels. But the price of this feat was high. Facilities were depleted, and thousands of skilled workers died at the front or from starvation. Many workshops were destroyed by direct hits. Although the plants were not captured, their potential was undermined for years to come. The Baltics and the Black Sea. Ship repair yards in Tallinn, Riga, Odessa, Sevastopol, and Kerch were practically wiped off the face of the earth. The enemy systematically destroyed port infrastructure, 43% of all berthing fronts, 54% of warehouses, and 47% of the cargo handling equipment park were destroyed. In fact, only the shipyards in the deep rear could operate at full capacity. In the Far East, Amur shipbuilding plant, which continued to build warships throughout the war, and in Molotovsk, now Severodvinsk, where submarines were built, and ships of the northern convoys were repaired. But their capacity was absolutely insufficient to meet the needs of the entire country. By 1945, the Soviet shipbuilding industry, once one of the most powerful in the world, had been thrown back decades. Rebuilding what was destroyed required colossal resources and, most importantly, time. And the country had no time. Victory did not mean abundance. On the contrary, it only exposed the full depth of the economic abyss in which the country found itself. Huge territories were devastated. The industry of the European part lay in ruins, and agriculture was undermined. In these conditions, a fleet was not a luxury, but a vital necessity. Food. This was the most acute and pressing problem. The threat of famine was real. Fish, traditionally an important part of the diet, could have been a salvation. But the fishing fleet was destroyed. Immediately after the war, the few surviving vessels and small trawlers received as reparations were used to replenish the fleet. Small wooden boats began to be built at domestic factories, but these were half measures. To feed the country, a powerful, modern ocean-going fleet was needed, capable of fishing far from shore in the rich fishing grounds of the Atlantic and Pacific. This required large freezer trawlers, BMRTs, fish processing, motherships, and refrigerated transport vessels to deliver the catch to ports. The USSR simply did not have such a fleet. Transport and supply. The giant country needed maritime transport like a circulatory system. Reconstruction, rebuilding, destroyed cities and factories required transporting millions of tons of building materials, equipment, and raw materials. The railways were overloaded and themselves in need of restoration. Exports. To To purchase technology and equipment from abroad, necessary for industrial recovery, currency was needed, and it could be obtained by selling raw materials, timber, ore, grain. These bulk cargoes could only be transported by sea. Strategic interests. The Cold War was beginning. Although the Soviet leadership adopted an ambitious program in 1946 to build large artillery ships, largely repeating pre-war views, there was an understanding that a real presence in the world ocean was needed immediately. Merchant and fishing vessels under the Soviet flag in world ports were not only an economic, but also a political instrument, a demonstration of the new superpower's presence and interests. Thus, by the end of 1945, the Soviet leadership faced a cruel equation. On the one hand, there were colossal, urgent needs for maritime transport and fishing. On the other, there were destroyed shipyards and the inability to quickly build the necessary fleet on their own. There could be only one solution. In the quiet of Kremlin offices, far from the public eye, a different kind of drama was unfolding. To admit one's own inability to provide the country with a vital instrument, the fleet was ideologically unthinkable for a system that proclaimed its total superiority. The idea of buying ships from capitalists, yesterday's and possibly tomorrow's enemies, seemed sacrilegious. Documents from that era shed little light on the internal debates, but the logic of events speaks for itself. Memos from the People's Commissariats later. Ministries of the fishing industry, maritime, and river fleets landed on the desks of top leaders, Stalin, Molotov, and Mikoyan, who oversaw foreign trade. The figures in these documents were relentless. The tonnage deficit was in the millions. The timeline for restoring domestic shipyards was years, if not a decade. And famine and a transport collapse threatened the country today. It was then, between 1945 and 1947, that one of the most unpublicized but strategically important decisions of the post-war era was made. There was no single loud decree on procurements published in the Pravda newspaper. It was a series of classified resolutions by the USSR Council of Ministers and Directives from relevant departments that, together, gave the green light for the mass import of ships. This strategy was pragmatic to the point of cynicism. It divided the world into three conditional categories of suppliers: former adversaries and neutral countries, Finland, Sweden, Denmark, and later West Germany. These countries possessed advanced shipbuilding technologies, but their political stance required cautious and complex negotiations. Countries of the emerging socialist bloc, Poland, the German Democratic Republic, GDR, and later Bulgaria and Romania. Orders for them were to become a form of fraternal assistance, tying their economies to the USSR while simultaneously solving Soviet problems. NATO countries and other capitalist states, Great Britain, the Netherlands, Belgium, Japan. Purchases from them were seen as a last resort for acquiring unique, technologically complex vessels that no one else could build. The first steps were taken in the fishing fleet sector. As early as the 1950s, the USSR began ordering large refrigerated transport vessels from abroad, without which oceanic fishing was unthinkable. Thus, in 1955-56, a series of 5 100-meter vessels of the Svetlogorsk type was built in the Netherlands, and in West Germany in 1955-58, a series of vessels of the Jana type. These were the first signs for the gold that was so necessary for industrialization. The country bought ships to feed its people. This decision, made in the quiet of offices, became the starting point for decades of a unique policy, a policy under which shipyards around the world, from socialist Szczecin to capitalist Hamburg, from neutral Helsinki to distant Yokohama, would launch thousands of ships, ships on whose masts the red flag with the hammer and sickle would be raised. They were built by foreigners, but Soviet people worked and fought on them. This was a fleet under a foreign flag, destined to become an integral part of Soviet history. There are paradoxes in politics and history that at first glance seem irresolvable. How could a country that had fought the Soviet Union twice in 5 years, inflicting humiliating and bloody defeats on the Red Army in the forests of Karelia, become not just a trading partner, but the main and indispensable builder of the most strategically important segment of the Soviet fleet? How did it happen that the keys to the Arctic, to the Northern Sea Route, the main artery of the Soviet North, were forged not in Leningrad or Mykolaiv, but in the shipyards of Helsinki? This is the story of the Finnish Vector, a story of how war reparations turned into multi-billion-dollar contracts, of how a former enemy became a vital contractor. It is a story of politics that was colder than Baltic ice, and of ships that were stronger than that ice. At the center of this narrative are the legendary icebreakers, which became a symbol not only of the Soviet development of the Arctic, but also of the unique, pragmatic, and deeply meaningful relationship between a giant superpower and its small northern neighbor. To understand why the USSR turned specifically to Finland, one must go back to the winter of 1939, the Winter War. A 3-month bloody slaughter in which the Soviet Union, despite its colossal superiority in forces, could not break the desperate resistance of the Finns. The world was amazed, and the prestige of the Red Army suffered a terrible blow. Although the war ended with the signing of the Moscow Peace Treaty, under which Finland ceded significant territories, resentment and distrust remained on both sides. This distrust erupted into the Continuation War of 1941-1944, where Finland sided with Nazi Germany, seeking to reclaim its lost lands. But by 1944, against the backdrop of the Wehrmacht's defeats on the Eastern Front, the Finnish leadership realized the inevitability of defeat. On September 19, 1944, an armistice agreement was signed in Moscow. Its terms were harsh, but not fatal to Finnish statehood. In addition to territorial concessions, Finland was obliged to pay reparations. It was in the wording of these reparations that Stalin's brilliant and far-sighted calculation lay. The sum was set at $300 million in 1938 US dollars, which, considering inflation, amounted to about $10 million, was to be covered by deliveries of machinery and shipbuilding products. For Finland, this was a shock. At that time, it was a predominantly agrarian country with a developed woodworking industry. Heavy engineering and, in particular, complex shipbuilding were in their infancy. The shipyards were small and specialized mainly in the repair and construction of small vessels. The demand to build ocean-going steamers, barges, and, most difficult of all, sea tugs seemed impossible. It was a national challenge, a matter of survival, an option. It threatened the complete loss of sovereignty. The Soviet calculation was precise and multi-layered. First, the USSR received the ships it needed without spending precious foreign currency. Second, and this was the main point, the reparation deliveries forcibly restructured the entire Finnish economy. To meet the terms, the Finns had to create entire branches of heavy industry from scratch, build new workshops, purchase equipment, and train engineers. Third, by creating this industry, Finland became economically dependent on its eastern neighbor. When the reparations ended, what would they do with these new giant factories? The only market for such specific products could be the Soviet Union. Thus, through economic coercion, Stalin solved a crucial geopolitical problem, turning a former enemy into a predictable and dependent economic partner, creating a buffer zone on his northwestern borders. For Finland, this marked the beginning of the so-called Paasikivi-Kekkonen line, a policy of strict neutrality based on the closest possible economic cooperation with the USSR. Shipbuilding became the backbone of this policy. The Finns paid the price for peace, and this price was paid in tons of steel, in thousands of miles of welded seams, and in dozens of ships built for their former adversary. The first vessels built as part of the reparations were mainly non-self-propelled barges, small sea tugs, and sailing schooners. But by the late 1940s, as Finnish shipyards gained experience and muscle, blueprints that would define the fate of the Arctic for half a century landed on the desks of Soviet trade representatives. The Arctic. Endless ice fields, polar night, brutal frosts. For the Soviet Union, this was not just the edge of the world. It was the country's facade facing the most important sea routes, the Northern Sea Route, the shortest route between. The European part of the country and the Far East had colossal economic and military significance, but for its year-round, or at least extended, navigation. A fleet capable of breaking through multi-meter thick ice was required. By the early 1950s, the core of the Soviet icebreaker fleet consisted of outdated steam-powered vessels, many of which were built before the revolution. The legendary Krezin, built in 1917, and Yermak, won 1898, these distinguished veterans could no longer cope with the USSR's growing ambitions in the Arctic. New, powerful, modern ships were needed. In 1954, the USSR Ministry of the Maritime Fleet placed an order with the Wärtsilä shipyard in Helsinki that was both the greatest honor and the most difficult test for Finnish shipbuilders. The order was for a series of 3 diesel-electric icebreakers, each with 22,000 horsepower. Nothing like it had ever been built anywhere in the world. This was Project 55. The lead ship of the series was given a symbolic name, Moskva, Moscow. Commentary from a shipbuilding historian. For Wärtsilä, this was a breakthrough. They created a unique design. The main feature of the Moskva-class icebreakers was their diesel-electric power plant. 9 powerful diesel engines turned generators that produced current for 3 propulsion electric motors. This provided incredible flexibility in power management and high torque at low revolutions, which is critical for icebreaking. The hull of the icebreaker had a special egg-shaped form that prevented the ice from compressing and crushing it, instead pushing the ship upwards. It could move continuously in ice up to 1.5 meters thick, and by ramming, it could break even much thicker ice fields. It was a technological masterpiece of its time. Following Moskva, launched in 1959, came Leningrad, 1961, and Kiev, 1965. Later, as part of the next series of contracts, the similar Murmansk, 1968, and Vladivostok, 1969 were built. 5 twin icebreakers named after the main cities and ports of the Soviet Union. Their appearance revolutionized Arctic navigation. They became the main workhorses of the Murmansk Shipping Company, escorting convoys of ships along the Northern Sea Route and working in the freezing ports of the Far East and the Baltic. These ships became the hallmark of Finnish shipbuilding and a symbol of the Soviet presence in high latitudes. When the news showed a convoy of ships following a mighty icebreaker cutting through the White Desert, the Soviet viewer felt pride in the power of their country. It might seem strange to order diesel icebreakers from abroad when, at the same time in the late 1950s, the Soviet Union was making its own, even more impressive technological leap. In 1957, the world's first nuclear-powered icebreaker, Lenin, was launched in Leningrad. It was a stunning demonstration of the superiority of Soviet science and technology. The nuclear-powered ship had virtually unlimited autonomy and colossal power. So why did the USSR continue to mass-order diesel-electric icebreakers from Finland? The answer lies in Soviet pragmatism. Cost and mass production, Nuclear icebreakers were incredibly expensive to build and operate. They were one-off, prestigious projects for routine work in less challenging parts of the Arctic and for work in freezing non-Arctic seas. Baltic, White, Okhotsk nuclear-powered ships were excessive and unprofitable. Finnish diesel-electric vessels were cheaper and perfectly suited for the role of workhorses. Technological specialization, the programs did not compete but complemented each other. While Soviet industry focused on the unique and complex nuclear technology, Finnish shipyards honed the technology of diesel-electric vessels to perfection, becoming world leaders in this niche. Politics. Continuing orders in Finland was a guarantee of maintaining special relations. These were not just contracts, they were part of a larger geopolitical game. In the 1970s, the cooperation reached a new level. A new series of even more advanced icebreakers designed for work in the mouths of Siberian rivers, the so-called River Sea icebreakers, was built at Wärtsilä shipyards. The lead vessel of this series was Kapitan Sorokin, 1977, followed by Kapitan Nikolaev and Kapitan Dranitsin. Their special feature was a shallower draft, allowing them to enter rivers and the presence of an advanced pneumatic washing system, a device that supplied compressed air from special holes in the hull, creating a layer of bubbles and sharply reducing friction between the hull and the ice. These ships could operate in the harshest conditions, ensuring the export of products, for example, from Norilsk through the port of Dudinka on the Yenisei River. They were further proof that Finnish shipbuilders were not just fulfilling orders, but were full partners in solving the most complex technological problems facing the Soviet economy. Although icebreakers were the most famous product of Finno-Soviet cooperation, the shipyards in Helsinki, Turku, and Rauma built a wide range of vessels for the USSR. Often, these were unique, high-tech units that required non-standard engineering solutions. Research vessels. The Soviet Union invested huge sums in the study of the world ocean. This research had a dual purpose: scientific, prospecting for minerals, studying biological resources, and military, mapping the seabed for submarines. Hydroacoustic research. Finland became one of the main builders of the Soviet scientific fleet. It was at the Halming shipyard in Rauma that the legendary Akademik Mstislav Keldysh was built in 1981, equipped with the Mir deep-sea submersibles, the very vessel from which James Cameron would later film his Titanic. Cable-laying ships. In the Cold War era, reliable communication was a matter of national security. Underwater cables connecting various parts of the USSR and its military bases required special vessels for their laying and repair. Finnish shipyards built such highly specialized ships as Katun, Inguri, and Yana. Passenger liners and ferries for the needs of the Black Sea and Baltic shipping companies. Comfortable passenger vessels were built in Finland, such as the Belorussia-class liners, including the ill-fated Mikhail Lermontov or the Georg Ots class car and passenger ferries that operated on the Tallinn-Helsinki line. Supply, vessels and technical fleet, drilling rigs for shelf exploration, oil spill response vessels, floating docks, powerful ocean-going rescue tugs. The range of orders was enormous. By the 1980s, up to 80-90% of all Finnish shipbuilding production went to the Soviet Union. The economy of an entire country was working for the Soviet fleet. The Finnish vector is a unique page in the history of the Cold War, a story of how mortal enemies could become indispensable partners. For Finland, Soviet orders became the engine of economic growth, turning it into a high-tech industrial power. For the Soviet Union, Finnish shipyards became a reliable rear, building ships vital for the development of the Arctic, scientific research, and maintaining its status as a maritime superpower. After the collapse of the USSR in 1991, this stream of orders dried up, For Finnish shipbuilding, it was a severe blow from which it took many years to recover, reorienting towards the construction of cruise liners and special vessels for Western customers. But the legacy of that era still plies the northern seas. Many of those icebreakers, rescue vessels, and research ships built at Wartsala shipyards outlived the Soviet Union and continue to serve under the Russian flag. They are silent steel monuments to a bygone era, an era when great politics was made not only in negotiating rooms but also on the icy expanses of the Arctic, on the slipways of a small northern country that built a fleet for its giant neighbor. If the Finnish contracts were a work of political art, based on pragmatism and a complex history, then the relationship with the shipyards of the socialist bloc countries was a completely different opera. It was a symphony of a planned economy, performed under the sensitive direction of a conductor from Moscow. Officially, it was called Fraternal Assistance and Socialist Division of Labor. In reality, it was a gigantic program, unparalleled in history, to create a fleet using the forces of an entire military political bloc. The Polish People's Republic, the German Democratic Republic, Bulgaria, Romania. Their shipyards were transformed into giant assembly plants, working almost exclusively for one customer, the Soviet Union. From here, from the shores of the Baltic and Black Seas, thousands of ships entered the service of the USSR. Not unique icebreakers or complex scientific vessels, but the foundation of the fleet, its backbone, fishing trawlers, dry cargo ships, tankers. This is the story of how Fraternal Assistance built the world's largest fishing fleet for the USSR and fundamentally changed the economies of entire countries, tying them to Soviet orders with steel cables as firmly as their ships were moored in Murmansk and Vladivostok. To understand the essence of what was happening, one must forget the laws of the free market, competition, and profit in its Western sense. The socialist world lived by different rules, and the main one was the plan. In 1949, the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, or CMEA, also known as COMECON, was created to coordinate the economic ties of the socialist bloc countries. It was this body that became the main headquarters for distributing industrial tasks among the fraternal countries. The concept of the International Socialist Division of Labor was simple. Each country was to focus on the industries where it was strongest, or those it was instructed to develop, and supply its products to the entire socialist bloc. Hungary built Icarus buses, Czechoslovakia built locomotives and trams, and Poland and the GDR were assigned one of the key roles, shipbuilding. For the Soviet Union, this was an ideal solution to several problems at once: mass production and standardization. By placing orders for uniform series of hundreds of vessels at the same shipyards, the USSR received a standardized fleet. This tremendously simplified repairs, spare parts supply, and crew training. Engineer from a trawler built in Stralsund could work without problems on its twin that had just been launched, saving its own resources, while the shipyards of Poland and the GDR were building thousands of fishing and transport vessels. Soviet shipyards could concentrate on the most important thing, building the Navy, primarily nuclear submarines. There was an unspoken division. The civilian fleet was outsourced to CMEA countries, while the military fleet was built at home. Economic and political control. Soviet orders were the needle on which the economies of the fraternal countries were firmly hooked. The well-being of entire coastal regions of Poland and the GDR directly depended on decisions made in the Moscow State Planning Committee, Gosplan. This was a powerful tool of political influence, far more effective than tanks. Transactions were conducted not in dollars or pounds, but in so-called transferable rubles, a virtual currency. for mutual settlements within the CMEA, which further locked the economic systems of these countries onto the USSR. To understand the essence of what was happening, one must forget the laws of the free market, competition, and profit in its Western sense. The socialist world lived by different rules, and the main one was the plan. In 1949, the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, or CMEA, also known as CEMECON, was created to coordinate the economic ties of the socialist bloc countries. It was this body that became the main headquarters for distributing industrial tasks among the fraternal countries. The concept of the International Socialist Division of Labor was simple. Each country was to focus on the industries where it was strongest, or those it was instructed to develop, and supply its products to the entire socialist bloc. Hungary built Icarus buses, Czechoslovakia built locomotives and trams, and Poland and the GDR were assigned one of the key roles, shipbuilding. For the Soviet Union, this was an ideal solution to several problems at once: mass production and standardization. By placing orders for uniform series of hundreds of vessels at the same shipyards, the USSR received a standardized fleet. This tremendously simplified repairs, spare parts supply, and crew training. Engineer from a trawler built in Stralsund could work without problems on its twin that had just been launched, saving its own resources. While the shipyards of Poland and the GDR were building thousands of fishing and transport vessels, Soviet shipyards could concentrate on the most important thing: building the Navy, primarily nuclear submarines. There was an unspoken division. The civilian fleet was outsourced to CMEA countries, while the military fleet was built at home. Economic and political control, Soviet orders were the needle on which the economies of the fraternal countries were firmly hooked. The well-being of entire coastal regions of Poland and the GDR directly depended on decisions made in the Moscow State Planning Committee, Gosplan. This was a powerful tool of political influence, far more effective than tanks. Transactions were conducted not in dollars or pounds, but in so-called transferable rubles, a virtual currency, for mutual settlements within the CMEA, which further locked the economic systems of these countries onto the USSR. BEB, Warnerwerft Warnemünde, Rostock Shipyard. While Stralsund specialized in fishing vessels, Rostock built first-class dry cargo ships and container ships for the USSR. From here came series of ships like the Irkutsk type, the Kapitan Kushnarenko type, and many others that became the workhorses of Soviet shipping companies from the Baltic to the Pacific. The products of the GDR shipyards became a benchmark of quality within the socialist bloc. The inscription, "Built in GDR," on a ship's nameplate was a kind of quality mark, a guarantee of reliability and thoughtful design. For East Germany itself, shipbuilding became one of the key sectors of the economy, providing tens of thousands of jobs and a steady flow of transferable rubles from Moscow. It was a symbiosis that seemed eternal and unbreakable. The history of Polish shipbuilding for the USSR is a tangle of economics, politics, and the greatest historical irony. The Polish People's Republic became the second most important builder of the fleet for the elder brother after the GDR. The shipyards in Gdańsk, Gdynia, and Szczecin worked at full capacity, fulfilling Soviet five-year plans. Lenin Shipyard in Gdansk. This name thundered throughout the world. But before becoming a symbol of the struggle against communism, this shipyard was for decades a flagship of fraternal cooperation. It was here that mass series of ships were built for the Soviet Union. Fishing vessels, Poland, like the GDR, built trawlers, signers, and fish processing motherships for the USSR. For example, the famous Prometheus-class BMRTs or the Leninsky Komsomol-class vessels, dry cargo and timber carriers, Hundreds of universal dry cargo ships, e.g. the Communist series, came from here, transporting Soviet export and import goods around the world. Research vessels. Polish shipyards also built complex scientific vessels, such as the Nikolai Zubov class, hydrographic ships which made a huge contribution to the study of the world ocean. According to some estimates, in the 1970s, up to 70% of Polish shipbuilding production went to the Soviet Union. The economy of the entire Pomeranian voivodeship depended on these orders. And here lies the main paradox. The Lenin shipyard, built and modernized to fulfill the orders of the country of victorious socialism, became the cradle of the Solidarity Trade Union, the movement that ultimately destroyed the socialist regime in Poland and triggered a chain reaction throughout Eastern Europe. The electrician Lech Wałęsa and his comrades demanded higher wages and better working conditions, but their discontent grew on soil abundantly fertilized with Soviet money. The workers saw new and modern ships leaving the shipyard, destined for the USSR, while the shelves in their own stores were empty. The transferable rubles received for the ships could not be spent on Western consumer goods. The closed CMEA system generated a hidden tension that exploded in August 1980. History played a cruel joke. The ships that were supposed to strengthen the economic power of the socialist camp were built at the shipyard that became the gravedigger of that system. While Moscow was accepting yet another dry cargo ship from Gdansk, it did not suspect that it was also importing a virus of dissent that, a decade later, would destroy the entire structure of fraternal assistance. If a fish and dry cargo shield was being forged for the USSR in the Baltic, then in the Black Sea, in Romania and Bulgaria, other, but no less important, tasks were being solved. These countries did not have such deep shipbuilding traditions as the Germans or the Poles. In fact, a modern shipbuilding industry was created there from scratch with the active participation of the Soviet Union and for its orders. Socialist Republic of Romania, under the leadership of Nicolae Ceausescu. Romania tried to pursue a relatively independent foreign policy, but in economics it was firmly tied to the CMEA. The shipyards in Constanța, Galați, and Mangalia received their specialization, the construction of tankers and ore carriers. The USSR was actively developing its tanker fleet for oil exports, and Romanian shipyards became an important support. Medium tonnage tankers were built here, operating in the Black Sea, the Mediterranean, and to Cuba. People's Republic of Bulgaria. For Bulgaria, a traditionally agrarian country, the creation of a shipbuilding industry became one of the main projects of socialist industrialization. At the shipyards in Varna and Burgas, smaller tonnage dry, cargo, and liquid bulk carriers were built for the USSR. For example, a series of so-called river-sea tankers, capable of operating both on sea routes and entering the mouths of large rivers. For these countries, Soviet orders were not just business. They were the reason for the existence of their shipbuilding industry. This created jobs, trained national engineering personnel, and gave a sense of belonging to a large industrial project. But the price of this assistance was complete dependence. By the mid-1980s, the result of this long-term program was stunning. According to various estimates, from 30 to 40% of the total tonnage of the USSR's maritime transport and fishing fleet was built in the shipyards of CMEA member countries, over 2,000 vessels from Poland and the GDR alone. The Soviet Union, without diverting its own capacity from military programs, obtained the largest and most modern fishing fleet in the world and a powerful transport fleet that ensured its presence in all corners of the world ocean. The system seemed to work perfectly, but when the main customer, the Soviet Union, ceased to exist in 1991, this entire gigantic structure collapsed like a house of cards. For the shipyards of Eastern Europe, it was a catastrophe. Accustomed to guaranteed orders for decades to come, they found themselves face to face with the harsh global market. They did not know how to compete. They had no marketing departments and no experience in fighting for clients. Thousands of workers were laid off. Legendary shipyards, like the one in Gdansk, went through painful bankruptcies and restructurings. Fraternal assistance had two sides. It gave the Soviet Union a fleet. It gave entire countries an industry and jobs. But it deprived them of their independence and their ability to survive in the real world. Thousands of ships built within this system outlived both their builders, the socialist states, and their customer, the USSR. Many of them still sail the seas under the Russian and other flags. They are a living reminder of a grandiose, but ultimately utopian, project. A project in which friendship was measured in tonnage and loyalty was paid for with guaranteed orders. This fleet, built by the hands of brothers in the socialist camp, became one of the most impressive monuments to the bygone Soviet civilization. On the mausoleum tribunes, the leaders of the Soviet Union condemned rotten capitalism. The newspapers Pravda and Izvestia daily reported on unemployment, exploitation, and the imminent collapse of the Western world. From childhood, the Soviet person knew that the NATO bloc was an aggressive military alliance, the main enemy of peace and socialism. But while these formidable speeches were being delivered from high rostrums, the unthinkable was happening in the quiet. Offices of the Ministries of Foreign Trade and the Maritime Fleet, representatives of that very decaying West, engineers and businessmen from West Germany, Denmark, Sweden, Japan, members of NATO, were welcome guests. For gold and hard currency, which were as precious as blood to the Soviet economy, the USSR bought the most complex and technologically advanced ships from its ideological adversaries. This was the secret side of the Cold War, not written about in the newspapers. It was a window to Europe and Asia, cut not for friendship, but out of dire necessity. This is the story of how the Soviet Union, in order to remain a superpower, was forced to secretly acknowledge the technological superiority of its enemies and pay them for access to the technologies of the future. West Germany, the FRG, a NATO stronghold in Europe, the front line of confrontation with the Warsaw Pact, the post-war economic miracle, Wirtschaftswunder, had turned it into an industrial giant. Its shipyards in Hamburg, Kiel, and Bremen became synonymous with the highest quality and advanced engineering solutions. And it was here, to the very heart of the enemy alliance, that the first Soviet customers came in the mid-1950s. The reason was critically important. As we remember from the third part, GDR shipyards built hundreds of fishing trawlers for the USSR. The ocean fleet began to bring in gigantic catches. But this fish had to be delivered from the fishing grounds to Soviet ports while preserving its quality. This required special vessels, large transport reefers. It was then, in 1955, that one of the first major contracts with capitalists was signed. A series of 8 large refrigerated vessels of the Yana type was ordered from the Holzwerke shipyard in Kiel. These were first-class ships for their time, with a displacement of over 11,000 tons, capable of taking on board thousands of tons of frozen fish and delivering it across half the world. Commentary from an economic historian: these deals were the height of pragmatism. Payments were made not in transferable rubles, but in freely convertible currency, or, according to some sources, directly in gold. For West Germany, these were profitable commercial contracts that kept their shipyards busy. For the USSR, it was the solution to a strategic problem. They gained access to technology for quick freezing and transportation of products, which they themselves had not yet mastered. It is noteworthy that in parallel with the purchases in the FRG, similar refrigerated vessels were also ordered in the Netherlands, for example, the Svetlogorsk class series. 1955-56, which shows how acute the problem was. Other orders followed the reefers. West Germany built specialized chemical tankers and gas carriers for the USSR and, very importantly, supplied components. The heart of many ships, even those built in the USSR or the GDR, were West German. Diesel engines from firms like MAN or Make, as well as steering gear, pumps, and navigation equipment. This hidden technological dependence was one of the biggest secrets of Soviet industry. Officially, they were building a Soviet ship, but its key components often came from Hamburg or Augsburg, Denmark, another NATO country, a quiet and calm Scandinavian monarchy, and also the home of a world-renowned shipbuilding company, Burmeister and Wain, B&W of Copenhagen. This firm was famous for two things: marine diesel engines of unsurpassed reliability and the elegant, well-thought-out design of the ships themselves. And the Soviet Union could not pass it by. B&W engines became the heart of thousands of ships around the world. The USSR was no exception. The Bryant's machine-building plant bought a license and for decades produced diesels based on Danish drawings. But Soviet customers wanted not only the engines, but the ships themselves. In the 1960s, when Soviet citizens first had opportunities for sea cruises on the Black Sea and international lines required prestigious liners, the USSR once again turned to the West. A series of large refrigerated vessels of the Sibir. Type 1962-64 was ordered from the B&W shipyard in Denmark. These ships, with a displacement of about 15,000 tons, were among the most advanced in the world. They could transport not only frozen products, but also fresh fruit, thanks to modern ventilation and cooling systems. Their appearance allowed the USSR not only to meet its own needs, but also to enter the international market with a maritime transport of perishable goods. In addition, Denmark was a pioneer in the construction of roll-on, roll-off, ro-ro passenger ferries. Such vessels were needed for lines in the Baltic and Black Seas. And although many famous Soviet liners, such as the Ivan Franko series, were built in the GDR, their design and layout were largely inspired by Western, including Danish, models. Danish shipyards set the standard to which even the socialist camp aspired. In the 1970s, the world was gripped by an oil crisis. The price of black gold skyrocketed. For the Soviet Union, with its gigantic reserves, it was a golden age. Petrodollars flowed into the country, allowing it to buy grain and Western technology. But to maintain production, it was necessary to go offshore to the seabed, primarily in the Caspian and Black Seas. And here the USSR hit a technological wall. Soviet industry did not produce equipment for deep-sea offshore drilling. There were no floating drilling rigs, no dynamic positioning systems, no blowout preventers capable of operating under immense pressure. All these technologies were concentrated in countries that Soviet propaganda called nothing less than sharks of imperialism, the USA, Norway, and Great Britain. Ideology had to be set aside once again. A secret and complex operation to acquire forbidden technologies began. Direct purchases from the U.S. were impossible due to the COCOM, Coordinating Committee for Multilateral Export Controls, embargo which banned the supply of strategic goods and dual-use technologies to the USSR. But workarounds were found. The main contractor was again neutral, Finland, the Rauma Repola shipyard. But the Finns only built the hulls. The entire filling, the very heart of the drilling rigs, was Western. Semi-submersible drilling rigs, SSDRs. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, a series of unique SSDRs of the Caspian shelf types were built in Finland for the USSR. They could drill wells at depths of hundreds of meters, but there, Drilling complexes, control systems, and pipes were all produced by American firms like National Oilwell Varco, Cameron, and Hydro. The equipment was purchased through Finnish intermediaries and installed at the shipyard, formally not, violating the embargo. Drill ships. At the same time, self-propelled drill ships were also being built. For example, the famous Valentin Shashin, built in Finland in 1981. It was equipped with a dynamic positioning system that allowed it to hold a position over a well without anchors, even in a storm. This technology was cutting-edge and completely inaccessible to Soviet industry. This race for technology was a real thriller. Soviet engineers and intelligence officers tried to copy Western models, while Western intelligence agencies tried to prevent technology leaks. But in the end, pragmatism won. The Soviet Union gained access to its continental shelf, paying for it with hard currency to its geopolitical adversaries. It was one of the most expensive and strategically important procurements in the history of the Soviet fleet. At the other end of Eurasia, in the Pacific Ocean, another capitalist power was rising, Japan. The post-war Japanese economic miracle had made it the world's #1 shipbuilder. No one could build large ships as quickly, as well, and as cheaply as the Japanese. And for the Soviet Union, with its huge needs in the Far East, Japanese shipyards became a crucial partner. The partnership was mutually beneficial. Japan needed Soviet timber, coal, and ore, and the USSR needed Japanese ships to transport these goods. In addition, Japan was located close to the main ports of the Soviet Far East, Vladivostok and Nakotka. Japanese shipyards like Mitsubishi, IHI, and Hitachi Zoshin built for the USSR large tonnage tankers and bulk carriers. These giants were necessary for the export of Soviet oil and the import of grain, which the USSR began to purchase en masse from abroad in the 1970s. Floating factories and docks. One of the most interesting import items was floating docks. The Soviet fleet, both military and civilian, was growing. Giant aircraft carrying cruisers and nuclear submarines were appearing. But their repair required docks of appropriate sizes, and building them in the USSR was long and expensive. It was easier to buy them. It was in Japan and Sweden that giant floating docks were ordered, including the famous PD-50 built in Sweden, but Japanese ones were purchased under a similar scheme, which could accommodate any ship of the Soviet Navy for repairs, including aircraft carriers. The purchase of a dock to repair the flagships of the Soviet fleet from a NATO country. Although Sweden was neutral, it cooperated closely with the West, was the pinnacle of this technological paradox. Dredging and technical vessels. To keep ports in working order, a powerful dredging fleet was required. Japan, with its vast experience in creating artificial islands and ports, was a world leader in this field and readily built such. Vessels for the USSR. Deals with the capitalists were an admission of fact. In the race of civilian technologies, the planned economy was beginning to lose. Where flexibility, innovation, and the highest quality were required, not mass production, the Soviet Union was forced to turn to its ideological opponents. It paid them for ships that became symbols of its own power, reefers that brought fish to the tables of Soviet citizens, drilling rigs that extracted oil for the state, docks that repaired its formidable aircraft carriers. It was an expensive, humiliating, but vitally necessary strategy. Every such vessel built in Hamburg, Copenhagen, or Yokohama was not just a ship. It was proof that even behind the Iron Curtain, it was impossible to wall oneself off from the rest of the world. And that sometimes, to survive, even a superpower has to knock on the doors of its enemies and silently pay the bill. Great history consists not only of epic battles and fateful decisions made in the quiet of offices. It is woven from everyday life, from millions of inconspicuous details that shape the existence and worldview of an entire generation. We, have talked about politics, reparations, secret deals, and the technological race. But what did this fleet under a foreign flag mean to the ordinary Soviet person? The engineer from Novosibirsk, the doctor from Murmansk, the teacher from Odessa. This series is not about icebreakers smashing through the Arctic shell, nor about spy drilling rigs. It is a story about the ships that set no records and rarely made the front pages, about the unsung toilers, the workhorses of the seas, about the reefers that brought cheap ocean hake to the dinner table, about the gleaming white liners that turned the dream of a cruise to Yalta into a reality, about the modest ferries and floating docks without which the entire economy of coastal regions would have ground to a halt. This is the story of how ships built in Poland, Germany, Finland, and Denmark became part of Soviet daily life, part of family albums, and part of the very fabric of everyday existence in the bygone superpower. In any Soviet city, from Kaliningrad to Anadyr, in any cafeteria, factory, school, or university, there was one unbreakable rule. Thursday was Fish Day. This decree was introduced in 1976, not out of prosperity, but to compensate for the country's meat shortage. But the very possibility of providing a nation of 250 million with fish on an industrial scale was the result of a gigantic, well-oiled machine, most of which was created abroad. As we recall, hundreds of Atlantic-class trawlers built in the GDR went to sea for months, but their catch had to be processed and delivered to shore. This created the need for two other types of vessels that formed the basis of the Great Fish Conveyor. Imagine a huge ship, almost 2 football fields long, anchored for months somewhere in the central Atlantic. Like bees to a queen, dozens of fishing trawlers and seiners approach it from all sides. They moor directly to its sides and unload their fresh catch. Aboard the giant, work is in full swing. Thousands of people, mostly women, in workshops spanning several decks, are cutting, freezing, canning, and packing the fish. The Soviet Union was a world leader in the use of such vessels, and almost all of them were built abroad. Poland, Gdansk shipyard, the most numerous series of factory motherships, were created here. For example, the B-62 project, huge vessels of the Pionersk type, or the later B-670 project, giants of the Konstitucja SSSR type. One such mothership could process up to 300 tons of raw fish per day, producing frozen products, canned goods, and fish meal. The crew and workers on such a vessel could reach 600 people. A population of a small village, Denmark, Burmeister, and Wayne, for the most critical tasks such as working with valuable fish species, unique factory mother ships of the Koroleva Estlianskaya, Vostok type, were ordered from Denmark. It was one of the largest such vessels in the world, a true flagship of the fish processing fleet. The ocean freighters, refrigerated transport vessels. A factory mother ship or a large trawler produced the product. But how to get it home? For this, there was a fleet of fast and spacious refrigerated transport vessels, the ocean freighters. They shuttled between the fishing grounds and the ports of the USSR. They would approach a mothership, take on thousands of tons of finished frozen fish or canned goods, and race at full speed to Murmansk, Riga, or Vladivostok. Their work allowed the fishing vessels to avoid wasting time, returning to port, and to stay at sea for 6 months or more. It was this fleet that was almost entirely composed of ships built in capitalist countries, FRG, Kiel, the Yana class series of vessels. Netherlands, Schiedam, the Svetlogorsk class series of vessels. Denmark, Copenhagen, large reefers of the Sibir and Povolchye types. Sweden, Gothenburg, the Bukta Ruskaya class series of high-speed vessels. This system trawler, factory mothership, reefer changed the diet of the Soviet people. Pollock, hake, mackerel, notothenia, and sori, previously unseen, appeared on the shelves. frozen fish blocks, and the famous Saira, blanched in oil. Canned fish became an integral part of the grocery basket. And behind all this was the unseen labor of tens of thousands of sailors and workers on hundreds of ships built for the Soviet Union around the world. In the 1960s and 70s, a new social phenomenon was born in the USSR, the mass vacation. The dream of millions was a trade union voucher to the south, to the warm Black Sea, to Crimea or the Caucasus. At one of the most prestigious and romantic forms of this vacation was the sea cruise, a snow-white liner, the cries of seagulls, the sea breeze, and a string of southern cities passing by, Odessa, Yalta, Sochi, Sukhumi, Batumi. This image, celebrated in films and songs, was made possible only by the large-scale purchase of passenger ships from abroad. Soviet shipyards, burdened with military orders, simply did not build large passenger liners. This niche was completely filled by the shipyards of the fraternal countries and Finland. GDR, Wismar, the VEB, Matthias Thesen. Werft Shipyard became the main supplier of flagships for the Soviet passenger fleet. Mikhail Kalinin, Class 1958-64, the first large post-war series of 19 ships. They were not yet giants, but they formed the basis of passenger lines in the Baltic and Black Seas. Ivan Franko, Class 1964-72, a true legend. 5 liners named after poets: Ivan Franko, Taras Shevchenko, Shota Rustaveli, Alexander Pushkin, and Mikhail Lermontov. These were large, comfortable vessels for their time, capable of not only Black Sea cruises, but also transatlantic voyages. They became the USSR's calling card on international lines, a symbol of openness and prestige. The tragic sinking of the Mikhail Lermontov off the coast of New Zealand in 1986 became one of the most high-profile maritime disasters of the late USSR and the end of an era. Poland, Surchikin, ships for shorter lines were built here, for example, the Kyrgyzstan-class series, which was actively used on the Crimea-Caucasus line. Finland, Helsinki. In 1975-76, the Finns built a series of 5 first-class car and passenger ferries of the Belorussia type for the Black Sea Shipping Company. This was a new level of comfort and a new word in transport, a Soviet car. Enthusiast could load his Zhiguli on board in Odessa and drive it off in Yalta. These ships were more than just transport. They were floating sanatoriums, palaces of culture, and symbols of the good life. For many Soviet people, a cruise on the Shota Rustaveli, or Belorussia, became the main event of their lives, a wondery memory for years to come, captured in faded photographs and family albums. And few of the vacationers enjoying the sea view considered that their dream palace was built by the hands of German, Polish, or Finnish workers. No metropolis could live without its unseen infrastructure, water supply, sewerage, power grids. Similarly, a giant maritime power cannot exist without its auxiliary fleet. The very workhorses that make shipping possible. And this critically important fleet was also largely imported. Floating docks. As we have already mentioned, floating docks were needed to repair the gigantic fleet, especially in remote bases in the north and the Far East. Their purchase in Japan and Sweden, the famous PD-50, was not a whim, but a production necessity. Without these docks, the maintenance of entire fleets would have been paralyzed. They made it possible to lift nuclear submarines and aircraft carrying cruisers out of the water right at their bases, saving months of time and huge resources. Rescue tugs and tugs. Powerful ocean-going rescue tugs, capable of coming to the aid of a vessel in distress in any storm or even towing a giant floating dock across the ocean, were another Finnish specialty. The Holyming shipyard built a series of Foti Krylov-class rescue tugs for the USSR with 25,000 horsepower, among the most powerful in the world at the time. Their presence was a guarantee of safety on the Northern Sea Route and in the World Ocean. River Sea vessels, a unique, almost purely Soviet class of ship. Thanks to the unified deep-water system of European Russia, ships could travel from the Baltic and White Seas to the Caspian and Black Seas via inland waterways. This required special vessels with a shallow draft and folding masts, but which were still sufficiently seaworthy. They were mass-produced in countries with no sea access, but with developed river shipbuilding. In Czechoslovakia, Komarno. Shipyards, Volgo-Balt and Amur, projects, and Austria. These unsung toilers transported millions of tons of cargo directly from European ports to industrial centers on the Volga and Kama, forming a crucial element of the country's transport system. Reefers, liners, ferries, docks, rescue tugs, river cargo ships. Thousands of these vessels, built all over the world, were woven into a single, invisible network that supported the life and economy of the Soviet Union. They were so familiar, so organically integrated into the landscape of Soviet ports and rivers that no one perceived them as something foreign anymore. They had become their own. But their story is not just a story about economics and everyday life. It is a story about the fundamental paradox of the Soviet system. Proclaiming self-sufficiency and superiority, it was, at the deepest, everyday level, dependent on imports. On the import of technology, the import of design, and, ultimately, the import of entire segments of its fleet. These unsung toilers of the seas were the silent but most convincing evidence of how closely the Soviet Union was actually connected to the rest of the world. The late 1980s. The Soviet Union is at the peak of its maritime power. It seems there is no corner of the world ocean where a vessel under the red flag with the hammer and sickle cannot be found. Mighty icebreakers of Finnish construction. Lead convoys along the northern sea route. Giant fishing trawlers from the GDR plowed the Atlantic. Elegant cruise liners assembled in Wismar welcomed tourists in the Mediterranean. Japanese and Swedish floating docks repair the pride of the Navy aircraft carrying cruisers, a fleet built by the hands of dozens of nations, enemies, allies, neutrals, has become a single, incredibly powerful organism, a symbol of the status of a global superpower. It was a triumph of a long-term, highly complex strategy that began in the ruins of 1945. But no triumph is eternal. When the foundation on which this entire grandiose structure rested, the Soviet Union itself began to crack. This giant fleet, assembled from all over the world, turned out to be a colossus with feet of clay. A fate as dramatic and tragic as that of the country it served awaited it. This is the epilogue, a story of what remained of the great fleet and the verdict that history itself delivered upon it. To comprehend the scale of the legacy, one must first assess it in numbers. By the mid-1980s, the USSR's maritime fleet was one of the largest and most diversified in the world, and the share of imported vessels in it was staggering. Merchant Fleet, Ministry of the Maritime Fleet. By the 1980s, the USSR's transport fleet consisted of about 1,800 ships with a total deadweight of over 22 million tons. The exact figures for the share of imports vary, but expert estimates agree that from 40% to 60% of the tonnage was built abroad. Moreover, for new generation vessels, container ships, bulk carriers, tankers, this share was even higher. On June 30th, 1966, at the height of the program, out of 552 seagoing merchant ships under construction for the USSR, 405 were being built abroad, almost 75%. This trend, though with lower figures, continued until the end. Fishing Fleet, Ministry of Fisheries. Here, the picture was even more striking. The USSR had the largest fishing fleet in the world, and this fleet was almost entirely imported. Large freezer trawlers, fish canning and fish meal factory, ships refrigerated transport vessels. All these were products of the shipyards of the GDR, Poland, West Germany, Denmark, and the Netherlands. The share of foreign-built vessels in the tonnage of the ocean-going fishing fleet reached 80–90%. Research and technical fleet. This category was almost 100% imported. All the flagships of Soviet oceanography, space communication vessels like the cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin, icebreakers, rescue tugs, floating docks, cable laying, and dredging vessels. All were high-tech products of Finnish, German, Swedish, Japanese, and Danish shipyards. By the end of its existence, the Soviet Union, despite being a great industrial and military power, was colossally dependent on foreign suppliers in the field of its civilian fleet. It was a fleet built by the world for one country. In December 1991, the red flag was lowered from the Kremlin flagpole. With it, the entire system that had created and managed this gigantic fleet collapsed. The unified ministries of the maritime fleet and the fishing industry ceased to exist. The mighty Soviet shipping companies, the Black Sea Shipping Company, KMP, the Baltic Shipping Company, BMP, the Far Eastern Shipping Company, FESCO, found themselves overnight in the territories of different, now independent, states: Russia, Ukraine, Latvia, Estonia. What had been built over decades as a single mechanism was cut into pieces by new state borders. Chaos ensued. The fate of thousands of unsung toilers was tragic and varied. Privatizatsiya and sell-off, a wild, often criminal, privatization began. The heads of former Soviet shipping companies, taking advantage of the confusion, created offshore companies and transferred the most valuable vessels to their balance sheets. Ships were sold for a pittance to cover debts or simply for the enrichment of new owners. The legendary Black Sea Shipping Company in Odessa, once one of the largest in the world, lost almost its entire fleet of hundreds of ships in a few years. Flag 2, flags of convenience, to evade taxes, customs regulations, and control from the impoverished post. Soviet states. The new owners massively re-registered their vessels. Yesterday's Ivan Seshenovs and Zoya Kosmodomayenskayas overnight became nameless, St. Nicholas's or Fortune Stars, under the flags of Panama, Liberia, Cyprus, or Malta. The red flag was lowered, and in its place a foreign one was raised, this time for real. By 2011, up to 71.5% of the fleet, controlled by Russian ship owners, was sailing under foreign flags. Arrests and abandoned crews. Many ships, burdened by the debts of their new owners, were arrested in foreign ports. This gave rise to a terrible phenomenon of the 90s abandoned crews. Sailors lived for months, sometimes years, unarrested. Ships in the ports of Africa, Asia, and Latin America, without money, without contact with home, and without the possibility of returning. Their ships, once symbols of state power, had turned into floating prisons, scrapping. A huge number of vessels, especially those built in the 1960s and 70s that had reached the end of their service life, were sent for scrap. The beaches of Alang in India and Chittagong in Bangladesh became giant graveyards for the Soviet fleet. Here, snow-white cruise liners and workhorse trawlers built in the GDR and Poland were turned into piles of scrap metal under the cutters' torches. Only a small part of the fleet managed to survive this collapse. This primarily concerned unique state-owned vessels. The nuclear and diesel icebreakers of Finnish construction remained under the jurisdiction of Russia and continued to ensure navigation in the Arctic. Part of the scientific fleet was preserved. Some of the most modern transport vessels became part of new, already private, successful shipping companies, such as Sovcomflot. But these were just fragments Morskaya, of former greatness. The grandiose fleet built for the USSR by the whole world was almost completely lost in one decade. So what was this unique strategy looking back from the perspective of the intervening years. A brilliant solution or a time bomb? The answer, as always in history, cannot be unequivocal. Arguments for an undeniable tactical success, solving urgent problems. Fishing fleet, ensuring transport connectivity, and exporting raw materials. Merchant fleet, concentration on the main goal. By freeing its shipyards from the mass construction of civilian vessels, the USSR was able to concentrate all its resources on creating the world's most powerful nuclear missile submarine fleet. The main guarantor of its military parity with the United States, a geopolitical tool. Orders placed at the shipyards of the socialist bloc firmly tied the economies of these countries to the USSR. Contracts with Finland ensured its friendly neutrality. Trade with the West provided leverage and access to currency, creating a global presence. In 2 to 3 decades, the USSR transformed from a predominantly land power into a global maritime force, whose interests and presence were felt in all oceans. Arguments against a strategic miscalculation, technological lag. By relying on imports, the Soviet leadership effectively preserved the backwardness of its domestic civilian shipbuilding. The country that launched satellites and built nuclear submarines never managed to establish mass production of modern tankers, container ships, or reefers. This was a conscious sacrifice that, in the long run, led to the technological degradation of an entire industry. Importing inflation and crisis, the mass purchase of ships, equipment, and grain from the West required gigantic currency expenditures. This made the Soviet economy directly dependent on world oil prices. When oil prices collapsed in the 1980s, the flow of currency dried up, which became one of the causes of the systemic crisis that led to the country's collapse. Creation of artificial economies, the shipyards of the CMEA countries, working exclusively for Soviet orders, were doomed. After 1991, they faced an inevitable collapse, which led to mass unemployment and social tension in Eastern Europe. System instability. The main failure of the strategy was that this entire gigantic fleet was tied not to economic efficiency, but to the political will of the center. As soon as the center disappeared, the system disintegrated, and the fleet, not adapted to market conditions, was instantly destroyed or absorbed by it. Decades of investment, expressed in gold, currency, and resources, evaporated into thin air. Ultimately, the story of the fleet under a foreign flag is the story of the Soviet Union in miniature, a story of the incredible ability to mobilize the resources of the entire world to achieve a set goal, and a story of the fundamental non-viability of a system based on a plan rather than on organic development, on ideology rather than on economic expediency. The USSR bought itself time, bought the status of a maritime power, bought fish for the tables of its citizens, but it could not buy the future. What remains today? It is in the old photographs and family albums, where our parents are smiling on the deck of a white liner built in Wismar. It is in the memory of the sailors who worked for months on trawlers from Stralsund and reefers from Kiel. It is in the stories of scientists who made discoveries on Finnish research vessels. And it is still at sea, somewhere in the icy expanses of the Arctic, a mighty Kapitan Sorokin-class icebreaker with the Russian tricolor on its mast still breaks the ice, leading tankers behind it. It was built by the Finns for the Soviet Union, but it now serves a new Russia, remaining as reliable and indispensable as it was 40 years ago. And somewhere on a beach in Bangladesh, the waves wash over the rusty skeleton of a huge ship. Local workers are cutting it into pieces. Perhaps it was one of those Polish dry cargo ships that carried Canadian grain to Novorossiysk. Or one of those factory motherships that fed the country for decades. Now it is just metal, a monument to a great naval armada built by the whole world and disappeared along with the country for which it was created. The fleet under a foreign flag has returned under foreign flags. The circle has closed. The story has ended. Only fragments remain, rusty and brilliant, tragic and heroic. Behind the numbers of tonnage and millions of transferable rubles, behind the lines on maps and the names of projects, there are always people, men and women whose lives were inextricably linked with these ships, built far from their homes. Their hands guided this fleet, their sweat soaked it, and their fates lived through it.